Welcome to the podcast hosted by timecam.com on how to stay on top of your work.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the podcast Stay on Top of Your Work. Today, I'm going to talk to Charles Vogl, who supports leaders. Using principles drawn from 3,000 years of spiritual traditions, he teaches how to build critical connections for leadership that impact generations. In his 20s, Charles served in the U.S. Peace Corps in northern Zambia. Then he founded Broken English Productions in New York City, and his projects touch on topics such as education, school reform, and civil rights advocacy. Charles is a regular guest lecturer at Yale, where he earned his Master of Divinity. His first book, The Art of Community, shows how both community and belonging can be built through time-tested ideas and rituals. And this is what we are going to talk about in today's episode. Charles, thank you very much for joining me here today. I'm happy to have you here.
Great. I'm delighted to be here.
And the first thing I usually do is I ask my guests to say a few words about themselves. And I think your story is really interesting and inspiring. So I'd love you to say a few words about yourself.
Well, what may be relevant for this audience then is when I was in my 20s, I became a genocide education activist. And what I mean by that is I started making a film that turned into a national PBS film here in the United States that told the story of a Cambodian family that survived the Cambodian genocide and became Americans. And that took about 7 years of my life. And one of the things I had to do besides learn how to make a film that would go around the world is I had to fundraise to make that happen. And so I was talking about genocide a lot, and I couldn't depend on the subject matter to engage people because nobody wants to talk about genocide largely, including me. And so that was the crucible where mentors really taught me how to speak with others so that we could bring people together around shared values to create something new, knowing I couldn't promise them any return on investment financially, and that we would only come together because we cared about something and wanted to create something that didn't yet exist. Subsequent to that, I was a secret labor organizer in New York City after I experienced labor abuse. And that was another case where I couldn't promise someone return on investment for profit. And people were really afraid to organize because of accurate fear of retribution. And so I had to learn again in stronger ways how to bring people together, to come together around something they thought was important. So after that, I went to Yale University to study religion, philosophy, and ethics. And largely, I was interested in social change. And one of the things that happened at Yale is I studied leaders in spiritual, political, and social movements, people who have been kept together for far over 1,000 years. And that was deeply inspiring. So when I got out of grad school, didn't know what to do with my life after being a filmmaker and studying religion. I was having lunch with a guy named Kevin Lin. Kevin was and is the founding COO of a company called Twitch TV. And Twitch, for those who don't know, brings together over 100 million unique users a month to come together largely using video around their enthusiasm for video games. And over that lunch, Kevin told me that while they had tens of millions of users every month, and he knew they would grow a lot, what he wanted to do better is create a stronger community for the people who are already showing up every month. And it was at that lunch where my head almost exploded with ideas, and I saw that Kevin had spent the last few years building $1 billion tech company, and I'd spent the last few years studying religious and social movements, bringing people together, and there was an opportunity to create something together that didn't yet exist. So my work right now is about distilling concepts that have been around for well over 1,000 years and translating them for the leadership of our generation so they can be used and relevant to bring people together. And for those of us who are out in the world, we may know intuitively, if not explicitly, that we're living in the loneliest generation, at least in American history. And there's also loneliness in other parts of the world. And that's caused by a number of changing factors which aren't going away. So anybody who's demonstrating leadership in this time is doing it amongst people who didn't ask to be born in the loneliest generation in American history. And this has been my journey to help address that.
Okay, that sounds really, really great, inspiring, and interesting. And I think it's quite a big problem, quite a big challenge when it comes to being and feeling lonely at work in particular. And what do you think we can do to prevent that and to find our place in company? Because I think, and I know many people who struggle with that. So how can we actually fight that and create
Well, I mean,
some,
this is, yeah,
you know?
your question is a broad one. How can we make differences at work that help people feel more connected, right? Less lonely and feel more confident they belong. And of course, there's maybe an infinite number of things to do. The book I've written is entitled The Art of Community. And it's a very specifically titled book. There is no one model of bringing people together. And it'll be kind of silly to think the way your family comes together and the way my family comes together and the people that you work with want to come together exactly like my colleagues do. That would be ridiculous. It's an art. We get to create something that works for the people we're bringing together at the time we're doing it. And there are principles, there are ideas that have been around for far over 1,000 years that have been bringing people together. So in my work, for the purposes of getting leaders in the right direction and inspired, we've distilled this down to 7 principles, at least in the beginning. And I'm happy to list them for you if that's helpful. Would you like me to do that?
Yes.
So the principles that we start off with that can help leaders get a long way are first the boundary principle, this idea that you need to know who's on the inside, who's on the outside. If you don't know who's on the inside of your boundary, it's very difficult to make those people feel more connected. Second, the initiation principle. People want to know when they're on the inside. They want to know when they're actual members. And conversely, some people who are visiting want to make sure they're not members. And you've probably visited places where you wanted to make sure you weren't a member, but you were happy to visit. Third, the rituals principle. In this case, rituals are things we do that have meaning. We're in a time where Americans, at least Americans, have largely left their home faith traditions. And with those, they've left behind a lot of rituals that mark our maturation. And so we're in a time where we're around people who are more hungry for rituals that acknowledge and represent our growth as people than maybe ever before. The next principle is a temple principle, this idea that we just want to find a place where we know we can find the people in our community. This can be a permanent temple or a temporary temple. It can be a formal one or informal one, but we want to find a place we can go. And if you're already managing a community or creating one, you may have noticed there are already spaces that are sacred. And what I mean by sacred is things happen there that don't happen elsewhere. And things that happen elsewhere don't happen there. And when we're in a leadership role and we can recognize sacred spaces and we can recognize what's becoming a temple space where people gather, we can protect those places and understand how they have a role in helping people feel connected. Next principle is the stories principle. Most people know what a story is. In this context, the story is the thing that we share that lets people know what our actual values are. None of us actually care what's on the website. The stories people choose to tell us and what those stories reveal about that community, that tells us what the real values are. And when I meet leadership that wring their hands because they can't find new members or people don't know what they're about, I ask, well, what stories are you telling people and how do they learn them? And if the only way to learn them is to hang out with you for hours and accidentally meet somebody who might tell them the stories about how that community came together and helps others, that's a lousy way to help people connected hear those stories. Next principle, the symbols principle, this idea that there are things that represent a whole suite of ideas and values. And everywhere you've been, you've seen symbols. I don't need to explain a symbol to you. One symbol I like to bring up when I'm summarizing like this is a token, which is a symbol that we can give someone that reminds them of their connection to us and our shared values. And most people I know have tokens from some place, both maybe formal, it was officially given to them, or informal. They kept it as a memory of a connection to other people. And if one of the things we want to do is give people a way to know they're connected to us and remind them of that, we can notice that we can provide tokens and symbols to remind them of that connection. And the last principle is the inner rings principle, by far the most sophisticated principle. This idea that in a mature group, you're going to have inner rings or smaller groups within the bigger group. But those inner rings aren't there to allow older members to brag that they're better than newer members. The inner rings represent a growth or a maturation in membership. a greater contribution. And so in a mature community that's healthy, those inner rings offer a path for growth for a member once they join. Presumably they're joining because they want to be who they want to be, and the group will help them do that. And that can be true in a professional setting. And the inner rings give them a way to grow in that direction. So those are ideas that we start with. And obviously how any given person would apply that to their group and their time with their goals is going to be wildly different. But as I've mentioned these right away, you're probably thinking of stories you've heard that inform you about groups that you care about, symbols that have been important to you and tokens you've taken, and places that have become special to you. Perhaps your family, there's a special home or place that you go to. And when leadership, we have words to talk about these and we can point them out and protect them, well, then we can build a connection and belonging in bigger ways.
This is so amazing because I remember I had some classes from linguistics and cultural studies at my university, and it looks like you covered some of these aspects in your book, and I think it's really interesting. Do you get inspired by the culture that surrounds you, or maybe by the documentaries you made? What is the inspiration for you? Because it looks like it's really deep. And it's something I've never actually seen before in people who teach other people.
Well, I like to think that everything that I write about and I teach is old. Old meaning that if you were to use this in your group, you're pulling on wisdom that have been bringing people together and keeping them connected for far over 1,000 years. And so you don't need to worry about this being a fad. And I'm inspired by people who have stayed together for untold generations. I think of the Jains in India, who are radical pacifists and have kept together during warring and peace times in India. I'm inspired by the Anabaptists who escaped persecution in Europe. I'm inspired by Zen monastics who have a lot of ritual and sequester themselves and actually dissuade people from joining when they approach, and yet they've maintained that tradition for hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm inspired by the Jewish tribe that has been persecuted over at least 1,000 years and still has stuck together. And while we don't need to think that any one of these groups is fantastic or they've mastered it, we can notice that these principles that I've distilled and translated for our time are there, and we can use them ourselves, and they're not difficult. I write in the book how there's a friend of mine who's very famous, and because he's very famous, a lot of people want to be his friend and act kind of goofy around him. And I thought that we really were friends, but I didn't know if maybe I was just looked like another hanger-on. And then one night, in the middle of the night, he called me after he'd had a breakup. And for several hours on the phone, we talked about how it was difficult for him and what was next. And I knew that he doesn't call a lot of people about that breakup in the middle of the night. And I knew at that moment I really was, if you will, in an inner ring of friendship that I wondered if we were in. So in some ways, that was an informal initiation. I knew at that point I really was in this trusted group of friends. But that was an accident, right? It would have been really great if months or years earlier he had put an arm around me at an event and said, Charles, I recognize whenever you're around me, you're never asking me for something. You're never trying to get me to give you something. You aren't trying to become famous, and you don't want me to invest in anything. You're just a friend who always talks to me straight and worries about my welfare. And if he had done that, then that would have been an initiation as well of knowing that I was part of friends who were something more than just hanger-ons.
Okay, so I'd like to go back to your book, actually. You gave all these 7 principles, and I'm thinking about creating a good community at a company. And for example, at Time Camp, it works pretty well, and we have a defined structure and everything. But I know there are many companies who actually struggle with that. What can we do to build a good, a strong community of people who trust each other? Because I think it's always a difficult thing. What do you think about it?
Well, I don't know what you should do because I don't know people you want to bring together. I don't know what they want. I don't know what they already think of you. I don't know what would make it exciting for them to come together. But I have a bunch of questions, right? And the first question is, well, why would they want to come together? Do they want to come together because you want to come together? Do you want them to come together because you want to be popular? Or do you want to come together because you want them professionally or some other way, right? If the reason you want to bring them together is you want to be popular, then that might be a lousy reason to just bring people together, right? So obviously you didn't answer that, good or bad. I'm just saying that those are questions. And one of the things we need to understand is community takes time. So I'll explain to you a story that stands out in my mind. I was working with student religious leaders at Harvard University. And at one point, one of the Catholic leaders asked me, Charles, we know how many Catholic students are at Harvard because Harvard tells us. We know how many students come to Mass because we can count them. And we know how many students don't come to all of our other events because we see that they're not there. How can we create stronger community in the Harvard Catholic group? And of course, I didn't know, right? Because I don't know the students. I don't know what they want. I don't know what's going on. But I did have questions. My first question was, in their first year at Harvard, how many phone calls does a student get inviting them to one of these midweek events? And the answer, of course, is zero. They get 0 calls all year. What they do get is a mass email. And so one way to interpret what I was being asked is, Charles, what is the magic email to make community happen amongst us? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't think it exists. I get that most people want to know the magic email, and they want what I call mail merge community, right? What's the easiest, fastest way I can bring people together who aren't? I've never found a community that actually coalesces that way. So one of the questions I have in your question, as I did with them, is what are people being invited to? How often are they being invited? And if the answer is, well, they're being invited to nothing, or they're invited to debates, or they're invited to events where they have to learn something, right, where they're not connecting with one another, then no wonder people aren't coming, right? I don't know how many debates I want to go to a year. I don't know how many events I want to go to where I just listen to someone talk about something they think they know a lot about, right? That's not bad, but that doesn't build community. So the first question I have is, what are they getting invited to, and how often are they getting invited? And if they're getting invited once a year, no surprise, there's not a sense of community. If they're getting invited once a week, well, then we get to talk about what they're getting invited to. So I would start there, the power of invitation. And when we're in a leadership role, and in this case, all I mean by leadership is we're working to create something that doesn't exist, and we can't do it by ourselves, right? So by definition, we have to invite people to join us. We're now at some level demonstrating leadership. Invitations are powerful, powerful things. Whenever we invite someone to something, whether they show up or not, whether they've got a sick parent at home they got to take care of, whether they're taking a night class that takes all their time, doesn't matter. When we invite somebody, they get a data point that someone thinks they belong there. The second thing that happens is whether they accept the invitation or not, we demonstrate to them that we have the power to bring people together. Now, who doesn't want to know people who has the power to bring people together? Now, you may be failing, you may be no good at it yet, but you've given that person 2 data points. They know someone who brings people together, and they have a data point that they belong. In my experience, people are distracted by a lot of stuff, not the least of which is their own health and family and financial needs. And so we can't expect 1 invitation or even 2 invitations to be accepted. Part of that leadership role is to keep a cadence of genuine invitations to allow people to collect those data points until when they're ready and they want to, they show up. And that's just the cost of being in a leadership role to create community.
Okay, so I'm thinking also about the point of view of an employee, if a simple person who works in a company.
Right.
If there's someone who wants to make a change, is it possible to create a good, strong company culture and to communicate with other people?
Well, it's absolutely possible. I mean, there are lots of organizations that have really strong community. I'm thinking, it's not strictly a company, but I think of firefighters. And firefighters, the firefighters I've interviewed definitely believe that if they're in trouble, a colleague's going to come help. And that means inside the firehouse or otherwise. And for my work, I define a community as a group of people who share mutual concern for one another. Getting a group of people in a room is one thing. Saying we're a community is one thing. But to actually generate that sense of community, we need to have genuine concern, right? And that doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because you declare it. So I think it's entirely possible, but it's going to take investment. And part of that investment is time, right? If you're an employee who shows up, you're a manager who shows up, and you want to invest approximately 0 minutes connecting with other people, inviting the stuff, taking time out of the workday to connect, then you'll probably have a sense of community consistent with that investment, right? Whereas if there are several hours a week, be it over lunch or at the end of the day, where there's some investment, including time, to get to know one another, and that can be done poorly and well, well, then you're just going to feel more community, right? So the question that jumps up is, what does that time look like, and how much are you really willing to invest? I know whenever I run a team, I want to know that when something catches on fire, literally or figuratively, other people on that team are going to stand up and help put out that fire, right? Instead of stand up, go to the water cooler and say something in the effective, wow, did you see what happened on floor 3? So what I find is managers, whether they know it or not, are trying to create community. Now, they may not like that word because they think it means campfires and summer camp. Fair enough. Use whatever noun works for you. But if you want your team to care about each other and to respond when there's a need, like firefighters, that's community. And just like everything else that works in business, you got to invest in it. And we've created these tools to get that party started.
Okay. I'd also like to ask you, from your own experience with working with other people, what are the mistakes that people do that make them fail in creating a good company? Group of people who work together. What are the biggest mistakes?
Well, there's a very, very long list. And I think one of them is not understanding that those relationships take a time investment. And I remember consulting one organization in New York City, and I was with the executive leadership of the organization. And there was one person there where every idea that the executive team was putting forth on how we could help the emotional parts of a big change in the organization happen, that person said there's no time, the schedule's already full, everything's already committed. And I realized they're going to get results totally consistent with never finding time to invest in this, right? So that's one problem. Another one is not understanding that everybody in a product community, that means a company, want to be acknowledged. And there's this mistaken idea that if someone does something because it's their job, it doesn't need acknowledgement. It doesn't need to be recognized by peers or superiors. And rituals, of course, are one way of acknowledging, but that can happen before you have rituals, just to acknowledge that. And one of the ways that we celebrate, one ritual that's important, is celebration. And every community you've ever been part of, from your family to school friends, you all celebrate, right? There are times where you just celebrate. And when you do that, where there's food, we have a very fancy term for that. It's called a feast. In the United States, we have a Thanksgiving feast. Often there's a Christmas feast, right? It's not rocket science. However, I find in organizations, celebrations and feasts are relegated till 10 p.m. at night in the back of a bar after a long day at work when everybody has to get up the next morning. What's a lousy place to put something terribly important in creating community, right? And if you're like me, you don't want to be up in a bar at 10:30 at night after a long work day knowing I got to get up. So now I won't even participate in the celebration. And there's no community you've ever been part of where celebration was a huge part of it, right? That's why we've been to so many birthday parties, we can't even count them all, because we want to be part of a community that acknowledges us as we mature through age. So not acknowledging that time needs to be set aside and not understanding that acknowledgement is terribly, terribly rich are both challenges I see over and over again.
So I have one last question to you, which is connected with the name of the podcast. How do you stay on top of your work?
Well, I'm old enough that years before I burned myself out so much that I have two distinct memories of pushing my body until I could no longer work and I collapsed and hurt relationships because of it. And I'm really interested in never doing that again. So at this point in my life, I only commit to the things I know I can deliver. And if an emergency comes up and I can't deliver it, I tell people right away, I'm not going to deliver that. And I know that there's an infinite number of things that I could do. And I know that there's a fictional version of myself that gets everything done on time and does way more of it. And that nobody's ever met that guy, but I know that in my mind he exists and he's always beating me. And because I know that nobody's met that guy, he doesn't exist, I remind myself that I need to go slow and cover less ground and make sure what I commit to I do, and I do it well. And if that means I do less than I want to do or less than other people want me to do, then that's just the cost of doing good work at a level that I'm proud of and doesn't burn me out.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Charles, very much for this interview. It was my pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it's exciting to be invited. Thank you for inviting me to talk about belonging.
Thank you so much.
This podcast was brought to you by Timecam. You can listen to it on iTunes and SoundCloud. Subscribe to get more content and always stay on top of your work.